In the quiet farmland outskirts of Fremont, Ohio, the year 1856 brought with it an event so bizarre that it quickly became the subject of hushed speculation and unnerved curiosity. A woman named Margaret Whaley, known for her reclusive nature and delicate health, gave birth to 3 sons. The fact that they were triplets was shocking enough for the small town, but what truly unsettled the midwives and neighbors was their appearance. Each child bore an identical, crescent-shaped birthmark on the inside of the left wrist, dark, raised, and unlike anything the midwife had seen before. What made this even more eerie was the position of the birthmarks. Though the boys looked alike, these marks were precisely mirrored on each child, suggesting an unnatural symmetry. To add to the mystery, Margaret claimed to have no history of multiple births in her family, nor did her husband Thomas, a blacksmith who was regarded as practical and emotionally grounded. No one could offer an explanation. The family didn't dwell publicly on the oddities. Life in a rural 19th-century town demanded resilience and discretion. But as the triplets named Elias, Ezra, and Eli began to grow, their peculiarity deepened. From as early as 6 months old, neighbors noticed strange behavioral similarities among the 3. When one laughed, the others laughed within seconds, even when separated into different rooms. If one cried during the night, the other 2 would wake up screaming simultaneously, their cries harmonizing eerily. The Whaleys initially dismissed it as coincidence or the natural bond of siblings. But as the months turned into years, the synchronicity could no longer be ignored. One day, when the boys were about 3, Margaret was baking in the kitchen when Ezra, who had been playing outside, suddenly screamed and clutched his wrist. Elias and Eli, who were in the upstairs bedroom, began screaming too. When Margaret ran to check, she found all 3 clutching the same wrist where the crescent birthmark sat, their faces twisted in pain. Yet there was no visible injury. As they began to speak, their parents noticed something far more unnerving than shared pain. The boys often finished each other's sentences. They used the same phrases in the same tone, regardless of whom they were speaking to. Occasionally, they would even speak in unison, especially when startled or excited, as though a single mind was operating 3 mouths. By the time they were 5, Thomas insisted on having them taught in separate rooms with different tutors. But each tutor returned with a similar report. The boys not only learned at the same rate but frequently produced identical answers, down to the same handwriting and minor errors. When a physician from Sandusky came to investigate, he was left speechless. He had seen cases of twins displaying strong psychological connections, but never anything approaching the level of the Whaley triplets. As they approached age 7, the boys began to exhibit a peculiar behavior that defied both logic and natural law. They would often be found standing in a triangle formation, facing one another in absolute silence, as if engaged in some sort of wordless communication. These episodes lasted several minutes and would end abruptly, with all 3 boys resuming their previous activities without comment. A neighbor who witnessed one of these episodes claimed to have seen the boys' shadows behaving independently, twitching and stretching in ways that did not match their physical movements. He swore off ever visiting the Whaley home again. Rumors began to swell in town. Some whispered that the triplets were possessed. Others believed they were the result of some ancient curse or an omen from God. Margaret and Thomas tried to shield their children from these rumors, but isolation only seemed to intensify the mystery. During one particularly harsh winter, a local preacher visited the family to offer prayer. The moment he entered, the triplets looked at him in perfect unison and said, "The cross has no weight here." The preacher reportedly stumbled out of the house pale and shaken, refusing to speak about the visit afterward. As strange as these incidents were, the triplets otherwise seemed healthy, physically capable, and emotionally neutral. They rarely expressed anger, sorrow, or elation in the way other children did. Their emotional range was limited, as if they functioned more as instruments of one singular consciousness than three distinct human beings. At age 9, a traveling scientist from Boston named Dr. Horace Linwood arrived in Fremont after hearing tales of the Whaley triplets from a patient. A man of Enlightenment principles, Linwood believed science could explain anything, and he arranged to observe the boys for 2 weeks. During his stay, he separated the triplets into 3 barns on the Whaley property, each several hundred yards apart, with attendants placed in each one to ensure no communication occurred. On the 4th day of observation, Elias developed a nosebleed during breakfast. Within 20 seconds, the other 2 attendants reported identical nosebleeds in the other barns, at the same time. Dr. Linwood documented the event meticulously, noting that he had witnessed something which suggests a singular animating principle shared by 3 bodies beyond comprehension or classification by natural science. Despite his scientific rigor, Linwood left the Whaley farm without providing a clear answer and never published his findings. As adolescence approached, the boys' behaviors grew increasingly introspective and intense. They rarely interacted with other children. They seemed content in each other's company, rarely speaking but always maintaining an awareness of where the others were. The strange triangle formations continued, sometimes lasting over an hour. They didn't eat unless all 3 were present. They didn't sleep until all 3 were in the room. They wouldn't respond to questions individually unless asked collectively. Margaret documented much of this in a private journal, noting her deepening fear that her sons were not merely connected but perhaps pieces of a single, fragmented soul. When one of them developed a high fever, the other 2 did as well, even if they hadn't been in contact. What was most unsettling to her was that none of the boys ever looked surprised by any of these shared experiences. It was as if they had always known this was how things were meant to be. The townspeople, increasingly wary, began pressuring the Whaleys to relocate or institutionalize the children. Rumors escalated into threats. A group of men once gathered at the Whaley property demanding to see the triplets, accusing the family of harboring demons. Margaret refused, and Thomas stood guard with his rifle. But even the threat of violence did not stir panic in the triplets. They sat quietly at the window, watching the men outside, their expressions unreadable, their gazes fixed, all 3 with their palms open and the crescent birthmarks exposed. When the men left, one of them reportedly went mad a week later, babbling about 3 faces with one voice that spoke without speaking. Despite the efforts of doctors, priests, and scholars, no one could explain the boys' condition. As they moved toward adulthood, their shared experiences only deepened, but so too did their isolation from the world around them. Every attempt to separate them long-term failed, and every person who came close to unlocking their mystery walked away shaken or disturbed. Their birth had baffled logic, but it was their mirrored existence, one thought, one pain, one life divided among 3 bodies that defied every known principle of human individuality and scientific understanding. By the time the Whaley triplets reached the age of 10, the townspeople of Fremont, Ohio had long accepted their peculiar bond as something otherworldly, something beyond the reach of medical journals or scripture. Despite efforts to keep them integrated in daily life, it was increasingly apparent that Elias, Ezra, and Eli operated on a level of consciousness that neither their parents nor the growing community could understand. The strongest evidence of this came in the form of their dreams. Beginning shortly after their 9th birthday, the boys started speaking aloud in their sleep, sometimes in languages their parents didn't recognize, other times reciting entire conversations that they had never been a part of. Margaret began documenting these occurrences in a notebook, and over time a chilling pattern emerged. The triplets were dreaming the exact same dream, every night, in vivid and disturbing detail. It began innocently enough. One morning, Ezra spoke of walking through a forest of black trees under a red sky, guided by a woman with no face. Margaret was unsettled, but she brushed it off as imagination. Later that day, Elias mentioned the same forest and the same faceless woman, though Margaret hadn't told him about Ezra's dream. When Eli described the same vision that night during supper, every detail matching down to the leaves crunching underfoot and the sound of bells in the air, Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched her journal. From that point on, each night brought a new layer to the dream. They described descending into a place underground, an endless spiral staircase made of bone-white stone, walls pulsing like they were alive. They each referred to a door at the bottom they were too afraid to open. The dream would always end the same way, with the faceless woman turning toward them and whispering something none of them could remember upon waking, though all three would wake at the exact same moment, gasping for breath. Doctors speculated it was mass suggestion, a shared delusion prompted by proximity. But when the triplets were separated for a week and kept apart with no means of communication, the dreams persisted, unchanged. Even more alarming, their physical experiences began to mirror their dreams. On the fifth day of separation, Ezra woke screaming with what appeared to be a burn mark on his palm, claiming the faceless woman had touched him. That same morning, Elias and Eli each had identical burns on their palms, in the same location and shape, though their caretakers insisted they had not come into contact with anything that could have caused injury. The burns healed in 3 days without treatment, fading to faint scars that never fully disappeared. It was at this point that Reverend Harold Quinlan, a local clergyman, took interest. He believed the boys were being spiritually attacked, either cursed, possessed, or chosen for something divine or infernal. He arranged for the triplets to spend a night in the church under observation. The Whaleys reluctantly agreed. At midnight, Reverend Quinlan sat in the sanctuary with all 3 boys asleep in separate pews. Just after the church bell struck 3, the candles throughout the sanctuary extinguished without wind or explanation. The Reverend later reported hearing 3 voices chant in unison, though the boys' mouths were closed. He described the sound as coming from inside his own head, echoing like it was being shouted down a corridor lined with mirrors. The next morning, he refused to allow the boys to return, stating only that their presence made the church an unsafe place for the soul. As they aged, the shared phenomena intensified. At 13, the triplets began experiencing injuries simultaneously. When one cut his hand on a broken fence post, the other 2 began to bleed in the same location, though no object had touched them. A physician from Cincinnati conducted a full-body examination of each boy and found the injuries identical not only in location but in tissue depth and clotting pattern. He declared the event psychosomatic beyond any known limit of the term. Their teachers began reporting another oddity: shared knowledge. When Elias was taught to recite a long passage of poetry, Ezra and Eli, who had never seen or heard it, could recite it word for word. Not just the words, but the same tone, the same rhythm, the same pauses. When Eli learned to sketch a rudimentary map of the town, Ezra and Elias both drew the same map the next day with matching mistakes, such as labeling a street with a name that hadn't been used in 20 years. When questioned about this, the boys did not express surprise. Their answers were always matter of fact. "We already knew it," Ezra once said when asked about a complex arithmetic formula none of them had officially been taught. "Because one of us learned it?" When asked how that was possible, Elias replied, "It just goes across." When asked what it was, all 3 looked at the questioner in unison and said nothing. They never spoke of the transfer of knowledge as a choice, it simply was. Their parents struggled to understand what was happening inside their children, but even that connection was wearing thin. As if the boys were slowly becoming more attuned to each other and less to the world outside their triad. The most chilling episode occurred during a storm in late October. Lightning struck a nearby barn, and one of the farm hands was severely injured. The Whaleys rushed to assist. While Margaret and Thomas were attending to the man, the triplets were left inside. When Margaret returned, she found them sitting on the floor in front of the hearth, eyes closed, whispering. The fire had gone out. All three were swaying slightly in perfect rhythm. As Margaret approached, she heard what they were whispering. They were speaking in a language she had never heard before, one that sounded fluid and unnatural, filled with soft clicks and long hums, punctuated by phrases that sounded like echoes from somewhere distant. When she placed her hand on Eli's shoulder to rouse him, all three boys opened their eyes simultaneously and looked directly at her. Their eyes were unfocused, pupils dilated, their expressions completely blank. Margaret recoiled in fear, dropping the oil lamp she was holding. The triplets stood as one, turned to the window, and stared out into the rain for several minutes without saying a word. The next morning, they acted as if nothing had happened. But something in them had changed. From that day forward, their speech became more selective. They began using phrases and metaphors that didn't match their upbringing or education, references to the Hall of Echoes, the Seven Hungers, and the silence before the first song. When asked to explain these phrases, they would simply smile and respond, "You'll know when it's time." Margaret's journals during this period became frantic and disjointed, filled with questions she could never answer. One entry simply read, "They are one dream split three ways. That's the only thing I can write anymore." The town grew increasingly uneasy, with more and more neighbors choosing to avoid the family altogether. Animals on the property began acting strangely as well. Dogs would not go near the boys. Horses would buck and scream if the triplets came too close. Even the crows seemed to follow them from tree to tree as they walked the fields, perching in a triangle above them, cawing in a slow rhythm that mimicked their footsteps. The triplets themselves remained calm through all of it. Their faces carried the same unreadable calm, their movements always coordinated, their presence unnerving to all but each other. Whatever force linked them together was growing stronger by the day, and no amount of scientific theory, religious counsel, or parental love could explain or undo what bound them. Their shared dreams were no longer something that happened at night. They had begun bleeding into the waking world, and the three boys who had once cried and laughed like normal children were now something entirely different. The event that shattered any remaining sense of normalcy within the Whaley family and left the entire town of Fremont grappling with terror and confusion occurred when Elias, the eldest of the triplets by just a few minutes, died under circumstances that no coroner could conclusively explain. It happened on a bitterly cold morning in January, when the boys were 16. The snow had fallen heavily overnight, muting the sounds of the farm and freezing the windows in thick sheets of frost. Margaret had risen early to prepare breakfast and was surprised to find Ezra and Eli already sitting at the kitchen table, motionless, pale, and staring forward without speaking. Something in their demeanor made her uneasy. When she asked where Elias was, neither of them responded. She called for Thomas, and together they went to the boys' shared bedroom. The door creaked open slowly, revealing Elias lying on the bed in his night clothes, eyes wide open, mouth slightly parted as if caught mid-breath, but no breath followed. His skin was cold, and his chest did not rise. He was utterly still. There were no signs of trauma. No injuries, no illness had been reported the night before. He had gone to sleep like always, laughing at one of Eli's jokes and sharing a look with Ezra that only they seemed to understand. The local physician examined the body and determined that the heart had simply stopped beating. There was no plausible explanation for a healthy 16-year-old boy to die so suddenly. What made the situation all the more horrifying was that at the exact moment Elias had passed, both Ezra and Eli had collapsed in the kitchen, bleeding from the nose and ears, their eyes rolling back, their bodies convulsing violently. Margaret screamed as Thomas tried to hold them both down, but it was as though some unseen force had taken hold of them, bending their limbs at impossible angles. The convulsions lasted several minutes before both boys suddenly went limp, their breathing shallow, their skin damp with sweat. When they regained consciousness, they had no memory of what had happened, only an overwhelming sense of absence. The grief that followed was complicated by fear. Elias had been the calmest of the three, the anchor. Without him, something vital was missing, not just emotionally, but in a very real, tangible way. Ezra and Eli began to suffer from severe psychological and physiological disturbances. They would often wake up screaming, their hands clawing at their own chests. When Margaret asked what they were dreaming, they both described standing alone in the spiral staircase from their shared dreams, no longer descending together but lost in endless solitude. The faceless woman was gone, replaced by whispers that echoed without direction. They claimed to hear Elias's voice calling to them, not from the world of the dead, but from within their own heads. Within a week of the funeral, Ezra developed deep gashes on his forearms, as though he had been attacked by an animal. Eli exhibited the exact same wounds, though neither boy had been outside or near any tools. The physician, now entirely unnerved, could find no explanation. Margaret begged the church to intervene again, but no clergy would return to the house. Even Reverend Quinlan had left town, writing a final note that simply read, "There are things older than Scripture. They live among us in silence." Ezra began losing his ability to speak for hours at a time, sitting in complete stillness and staring into corners of rooms where no one stood. When Eli experienced these same episodes, the timing matched precisely. If one was afflicted, the other followed instantly. It was as if Elias's death had not freed them from their shared existence, but fractured it, damaging the psychic thread that had bound the three into a single, cohesive presence. The most disturbing change came in the way they spoke of Elias. They no longer referred to him in the past tense. "He is still with us," they would say, or "he is just sleeping now." When asked directly if they understood that Elias had died, they would look confused, sometimes angry. "He is just quiet now," Ezra whispered once to Margaret, "but he is still thinking." Eli added, "He is behind our eyes when we blink." These cryptic phrases became more common. Margaret found herself afraid to be alone with them. They no longer responded emotionally. They didn't cry. They didn't smile. Their eyes always seemed half-glazed, as though focused on something beyond the physical room. One evening, Margaret found both boys seated in the barn where Elias had once carved his name into a wooden beam. They had dug into the earth beneath the floorboards with their bare hands, forming a narrow pit that descended several feet. When she asked what they were doing, Ezra said, "He is underneath now. We hear him clearer when we get close." The pit was filled in that same day by Thomas, but the boys returned the next morning and began digging again, this time in the field behind the house. Thomas had to lock the shed and confiscate the tools to stop them. At night, they scratched strange symbols into the walls of their room, circles within triangles, spirals intersected by jagged lines, all drawn in what looked like charcoal and blood. When asked what the drawings meant, Eli simply said, "He told us to make maps." Their physical health began to deteriorate. They grew thin and pale, their muscles weak, their limbs shaking frequently. Medical tests could find no underlying cause. Their pulses were low, and their pupils remained dilated even in daylight. Margaret feared that they were slowly dying, not from grief, but from the absence of whatever once connected them with Elias in full. She attempted to separate them again, sending Eli to live with her sister in Cleveland, but within 24 hours both boys fell into a catatonic state. Eli was found standing barefoot in the snow outside his aunt's home, whispering the words "triangle incomplete" over and over. Ezra, back on the farm, was curled in a fetal position under his bed, unresponsive. They were reunited the next day, and the symptoms disappeared. Margaret wrote in her journal that night, "I think they are one creature wearing two skins." The town, once curious and fearful, had now grown hostile. Whispers of witchcraft, devilry, and unnatural forces plagued the family. An anonymous note was nailed to their door, reading, "Return the dead or join him." The Whaleys had no place left to turn. Scientists, priests, and neighbors had all failed them. Whatever phenomena governed the triplets' lives had spiraled beyond human understanding, and now, with one piece of the puzzle missing, the remaining two were unraveling. One night, several townspeople claimed to see a dim light glowing from the boys' room despite no candle or lamp being lit. Some swore they heard three voices chanting again, even though Elias had been buried for months. A passerby walking near the house claimed to see a shadow moving independently along the side of the building, flickering as if cast by a flame that wasn't there. Margaret continued to write in her journals, though her entries grew erratic and desperate. She wrote of hearing Elias's voice in her sleep, of seeing fleeting reflections of him in mirrors and puddles. Thomas, once the stoic guardian of the family, had begun sleeping in the barn, unable to stand the atmosphere inside the house. He told Margaret one night that he no longer believed Elias had died, at least not in any way that made sense. "He's not gone," he whispered, "just removed. And not far enough." He refused to elaborate. One morning, he was gone. His boots still by the door, his rifle untouched, no note, no signs of struggle. The last thing he had said to Margaret was, "The triangle can't hold. It needs the third." Margaret was left alone with Ezra and Eli, who now rarely spoke, rarely moved, and yet never seemed asleep. They would sit side by side for hours, eyes open, hands folded in their laps, unmoving. When she begged them to speak, to eat, to explain, they would respond with cryptic fragments, "He's thinking through us now," or "He knows the shape of silence." They claimed to feel Elias inside their skin, directing their thoughts, pushing their memories aside to make room for something else. Whatever had been broken by Elias's death had not stopped the force that connected them. It had simply altered it, distorted it, and perhaps made it stronger in ways no one could have foreseen.